Okay, so we're about to start the next session. This is Martin Hebart. I love this title, Beyond Category, Reevaluating the Role of the Ventral Visual System for the Processing of Objects. Martin, please.
Thank you. Well, I hope that you're not only going to like the title, I hope you're going to like the talk, what we're going to see. I intentionally chose a bit of a more like controversial title because I think it's actually quite nice to have like some discussion going on here. So let's see what's going to happen. But as you all know, like immediately when you open your eyes, there's like a wide range of visual impressions. Like you don't only just see colors or like textures or shapes, but you see like objects that you can immediately recognize and you can make sense of. And I think currently dominant view of how our brains enable this is that there's this ventral visual hierarchy for visual recognition, which is known as the 𝗠𝗿𝗁 pathway, where you have like some early regions in the early visual cortex that are like primarily involved in processing like basic features like orientation or curvature or the texture of different stimuli, and then like these ideas that like stimuli are put together into more and more like complex combinations, and then like there's high-level visual regions that are like now responding to like specific combinations and that show like selective responses to, let's say, faces or scenes, or there's regions like responding selectively to body parts or objects. And you find like both in the ventral but also like in the lateral part of the visual system, you find these types of representations. And in this view, visual features would then, in a sense, like act as confounds if you're like really interested in understanding these category selective object representations. You really want to make sure that you kind of take into account these like basic visual features. So let's take the example of, let's say, a pizza selective region. If you want to find a region that's really only responding to pizza, then you also want it to be responding like selectively to like different types of pizza. You may want to also have it like respond selectively when you take away the color of the pizza, or even when it's like just a depiction of a pizza, right? But the question I want to raise here, and the question I want to ask is ventral vision actually really just object labeling? Is everything that we're doing is actually just attaching a label to individual objects? And if that was really the case, I guess that would just be the same thing that you would be doing with a child when in like in very, very early times you're actually teaching them that like this is a pig, this is a plant, this is a bucket. By the way, this is the type of book that my son loved, and he wanted me like to read these like words to him nonstop. But I would say, yeah, the question I want to raise is like, is that actually everything that ventral visual system is doing? And if you take this as an example, I just want to show you some examples of, like, say, a cup or an apple, a castle, and some vegetables. And if you look at this image of a cup, you can immediately see there's actually much more going on than just the presence of a cup. I mean, you immediately know, oh my God, this is something I need to clean up. This apple here might signify to you that it's something you may not necessarily want to eat. And this castle here might not only just be a castle, but it's quite familiar to a lot of people here because it's actually here in Rovereto. Then there's also like the arrangement of the different things that you have in front of you that can actually lead to different types of meaning depending on how they actually occur. And then you can have something that's completely strange that actually doesn't make any sense to you. And this is a computer-generated image that was specifically optimized for not being recognizable. Where at the same time, if I was going to ask you if that stimulus is more of a man-made object or more of a natural object, I think you would all agree that it's probably more of a man-made object, right? So even though you can't really put a name on it, you can still like make sense of it to a certain degree. And you may actually ask, are these visual features that you're seeing not actually necessarily also a part of the object's representations? So is it really that you're just trying to detach the visual input from like the label that you put on the image, right? So if you take this example here of a toast, and you might just immediately say, okay, that's like a yummy slice of toast. Well, if you paint it in like a slightly different color, then it's probably also something you may not necessarily want to put in your mouth. And if you take the example of a bunny, then obviously this bunny here is more like an animate object, but there's like other examples of the same bunny, and there's some really great research by Stefania is also looking at these types of stimuli where you can actually see that, well, actually this is not necessarily just putting a label on things. So what I want to propose in this talk, and this is not necessarily something, I'm not necessarily the first person to propose this, of course, but the proposal in this talk here is that there has perhaps in the past been a bit of an overly strong focus on studying the ventral visual system in terms of recognition and in terms of high-level category. And I think we need to be able to detach the study of object representations from the discrete labels that we apply to them. And that is something that is really, really hard, because the way that we operate and the way that we walk around the world is that we often think this is a cup, this is an apple, this is a, etc. And if we keep that way of thinking about like how vision is working, then we are already automatically in this way of reducing everything to the labels that we apply to our visual world. And my aim is to convince you that we have to move beyond this, and we have to actually think what is actually underlying these representations. And so this is suggesting a shift of the focus, not like from trying to understand what recognition or what categorization is, towards really understanding what are actually the core dimensions that span this representational space of objects, which is then underlying our ability to recognize and to categorize, but it's also underlying a much larger set of different ways in which we can make sense of our visual world. So these dimensions, if you want, would then be forming a behaviorally relevant scaffold of invariances that are underlying our ability to generalize and also to make sense of the visual world. And as I said, like, I'm obviously not the first person to propose that there may be some like features or some dimensions underlying the functional organization of the visual system. There's obviously like an early vision, there's retiноtopic organization as maps of the curvature, and then in high-level regions there's like animacy or real-world size. But I think that, like, despite like the really like strong advances that we've made with understanding the organization of the visual system according to such dimensions, they still like give you a largely incomplete picture of ventral visual cortex function. So what we really want, I think, is a bit more of a comprehensive understanding of what are actually these dimensions that are spanning the representational space. So the challenge really is that, like, how can we actually identify such object dimensions? And I think one of the traditional approaches in behavior has been really to acquire like similarity judgments of different objects and just do this for like all possible kind of comparisons here. And in brain activity, one approach has, for example, been to just like get voxel activation patterns or like in EEG or MEG with sensors, and then relating them to each other in some way. And what you can then do is you can look at the similarity structures, you can map them if you want, and then you could potentially identify a structure that may look a little bit like this. And then the traditional approach has been to try to interpret what these dimensions could then mean. And in this particular example, it could be like, well, that maybe animacy is really like an important dimension. It could be that the naturalness of the objects, so more natural objects are over here and less natural over here. It could be the movement of objects, that some objects are moving more than others. And it could also be the color, right? Like more like black and white, similar over here, and more colorful over here. So even in this like a two-dimensional depiction, I can already come up with 4 possible like ways of trying to understand this structure of these representations. And of course, like in reality, the situation is much more complex. We're not dealing with a handful of different objects, but we're dealing with thousands of different objects that we can distinguish from each other. And to make things even more complicated, we're probably not dealing with a two-dimensional representational space, but a high-dimensional representational space that we aim to understand. So how on earth are we ever actually going to be able to break down the complexity of these types of representations? The other challenge is, though, like if we want to understand this object space, we have to figure out a way in which we can sample from it. So what are actually the stimuli that we want to be showing to people in order to understand these representations? And I think like the more like traditional experimental approach, despite its like value, often means that we like a bit like astronomers pointing a telescope in the sky, and we're only like observing a very, very small portion of this representation. And then you may actually be missing a bigger picture if you're not able to sample the entirety of it. So with that challenge in mind, this motivated us to develop this things, object, concept, and image database. So this is a data set of 1,854 objects that are representative of the use in the American English language. This has led us to like 26,000 images that we actually manually created. So we manually went on the internet and searched for different images that are high quality. And we really tried to optimize these for vision science so that we really have like high quality examples, high quality images here. And what's really nice about this is that you can then go and you can apply the whole breadth of these like different stimuli to studying like representations in humans at different levels. But you can also apply them, of course, if you want to like animal models or even for using artificial intelligence. And beyond that, since you're now dealing with the same types of stimuli across different domains, you can now start to link these domains to each other. So you can maybe try to understand how like activation in one of these domains is actually linked to activations in another domain. And when we started this, and I was at that time still working at NIH with Chris Baker, and we later continued this work in Leipzig, what we did is we acquired fMRI, MEG, and behavioral data using these things images. And I started telling other people about this, and they got also really excited about it. And today is actually a lot of different people around the world who've started like collect and even make like publicly available data sets using these things data. And we're not like talking about like small data sets here, like just taking the example here of the monkey 𝗶𝗶 data from 𝗠𝗿𝗁𝗶𝗲. He like collected for all of the things images, monkey electrophysiology data that will be made publicly available this year. We have human EEG data that's also publicly available, and we have memorability scores from like the Bainbridge lab. So there's a lot of people have already been contributing to this and have been making their data even like available that you can also use for your studies if you're interested. And if you want to participate yourself and want to contribute to this, you can also just go to Things Initiative. If you have even if you have a smaller data set, you can relate them now to these like bigger data sets that are existing. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is like, okay, so this is like addressing one of the challenges is how are we actually going to be sampling these representational space. I want to just go a little bit into detail about like this things data that we have been collecting. So we have in 3 participants, we have fMRI responses to more than like 8,000 unique images of 720 of those categories. So it's quite a nice semantic breadth. We have MEG responses from 4 participants, and there's behavioral responses from an online study from like more than 12,000 people. This is work where the fMRI has been like analyses have been led from Oliver, and then Lina Teichmann from the Baker Lab has been really working very, very strongly on the MEG part. Okay, so this is like addressing one of the challenges that I've mentioned. Now, coming to the structure of the remaining talk, I want to talk a little bit about like the core dimensions in behavior. So this is like making use of these data that we've collected to reveal like the core dimensions underlying our mental representation of objects. And then in the second part, I want to be talking a bit more about core dimensions in the brain. And coming to the question that I was kind of starting to raise earlier, what is actually the function of ventral vision? Okay, so coming back to the challenge that we had initially, how can we actually identify these object dimensions? The approach that we choose here is that we use an odd one out similarity task, and I'll explain to you more about why we're going to be doing this. To sample the similarity of different objects to each other. What we then do is we develop a computational model of the task that allows us to infer the dimensions that people use when they're making these types of similarity judgments. And then we have this large-scale data set that I've been talking about, where we've done like large-scale crowdsourcing with 1.46 million responses. And just coming for the motivation of the task is we're using this triplet odd one out task, and we're asking like, okay, which of these 3 images is the odd one out? And you may say that, well, the dog is the odd one out because the dog is alive and the other things are not. You may say that the apple is the odd one out because, I don't know, the apple's round or the apple is something you can eat. And you might say that the car is the odd one out because the car is man-made and the other 2 images are not, right? So what this shows you is that you can already come up with different ways in which you can like make sense of like distinguishing between these objects from each other. And there's different types of dimensions that you can really start to think about. But another thing that's actually quite nice about this 𝗠𝗿𝗁𝗏 task, and this is like a problem that was raised in the late 70s by 𝗠𝗿𝗁𝗏, was that this is in a way overcoming a big challenge of the contextual dependence of similarity ratings, where we know that like the similarity judgments really depend on the context in which you're actually showing them. What we're doing with the triplet 𝗠𝗏𝗏𝗏 task is that we are changing the context in which these two stimuli are appearing by just changing one of the triplet examples here. And what this allows us to do is to look at the similarity of these two images relative to all possible contexts that are imposed by a third stimulus, which requires, of course, a very, very broad sampling, but that's exactly what we're doing here. So what this task does is it's really emphasizing the core representational dimensions, and it overcomes this problem that has been raised in the 1970s for measuring the similarity, because we now define the similarity of objects as a probability of choosing them together in the 𝗠𝗏𝗏𝗏 task and not the other one across all possible contexts. And it's also like just quite an intuitive task, and it's actually fun to do, and it is free of like response criterion as you would have it with normal similarity ratings. Okay, so we are also building a computational model of this task, and I also want to like give you some reasoning for why we do this. So what our idea really is that we want to reproduce the assumed cognitive process that's underlying these similarity judgments. Okay, so we have to make, of course, with such a model, we have to make some assumptions. One of the assumptions that we put in is sparsity. So that means that objects only have some of these dimensions. And that, of course, makes sense, because like if you take the example of a cup and you think about like some sort of animacy dimension, the cup should have a value of 0 in this, right? Like because it's completely inanimate. So this dimension should essentially not exist for a cup. And that is like an idea that's borrowed from so-called like feature-based models in cognitive science. And we're implementing this with a so-called like L1 norm. The other two criteria that we have is that the dimensions are continuous, so the dimensions can be weighted differently, and that is also something that is actually borrowed from like cognitive science, where we know that, let's say, different types of animals, that let's say a lion, for example, is much more of like a typical example of an animal as compared to, let's say, a fruit fly, right? So you might think of a lion not just being like an animal, but actually being more of a like typical example of an animal. And the final model like constraint that we put in is a so-called positivity constraint. That means that dimensions are always positive. And that is a really, really important part here, because if you're thinking about different parts or different like aspects of an object that you want to distinguish, the different dimensions shouldn't be able to cancel each other out, right? So you wouldn't want like the fact that the chair has legs, that the fact that it has legs to be canceling out that you can sit on it. They shouldn't be working against each other. They should just be able, you should be able to add them up, right? That makes a lot of sense. So this is all like implemented with a so-called non-negativity constraint. Okay, so what we're then doing is really straightforward. Essentially what we do is we have like for our different objects, we are initializing our model with 90 different dimensions. 90 is just an arbitrary number. And now what we do is we're extracting for a given triplet that we've sampled the vector representations for these 3 different objects. We are then, for all pairs of objects, computing the internal measure of similarity as the dot product between them. So this means like, well, if this pair here is very, very similar to each other, then, well, the other one should be the odd one out, right? And then finally, we're predicting the choice in the model. So in this case, it might be the dog might be predicted by the model, which is obviously completely random. But in actual fact, the participant was choosing an apple. And now the magic is kind of happening, since this is all like actually implemented in a graph model. We can compute like derivatives and partial derivatives, and we can actually now run like backpropagation, and we can use algorithms from artificial intelligence to actually optimize these weights. So we can change the weights to really be maximally predictable of behavior. And if we do this for like a lot of trials, and you really need a lot of trials for this, and after like 1.4 million trials, we end up with something that looks a little bit like this. And what you see is that the sparsity constraint has led us to actually having a really, really sharp cut at like here, where these dimensions really don't contribute anything really to the prediction of the model. So you can just eliminate them. So you end up with a set, in this particular example, of 49 individual dimensions in a model. Okay, so that's the model, how well does this actually work? What we wanted to see is like how well can we actually predict individual trial behavior in this odd one out task? Can we actually predict each individual choice that a person is making from this model, from these only like 49 different dimensions here? So chance is here at 33%. The ceiling of what we can measure is determined by the consistency of people's choices. So how consistent are people's responses? And they're going up to like 66 or 67%. So here's the model performance, and what you can see is that this model is actually really approaching the noise ceiling. In actual fact, it's actually capturing 92% of the explainable variance in the data. So I'm thinking actually that what this tells us is that this model is actually doing a fairly good job despite it just being so simple. But you're obviously also interested in knowing how well can it actually predict similarity judgments. So what we did is we sampled for a set of 48 different objects. We got a full sample of all like the similarity judgments in this triplet task. This is like the prediction that we get from our model for the similarity of different stimuli. And this is the actual fully sampled matrix. And I think you can appreciate that they look almost identical, and they're actually correlated by 0.9, which is again like at the noise ceiling. Okay, so this is interesting, but like, what does this tell us? Okay, we can predict like behavior, and we can get like we can predict the similarity structure. But what does this actually tell us? So what you can do is you can actually visualize again. It's more like traditional way of visualizing things in a down projection in two-dimensional space. And what you see is that different types of clusters emerge, really. And if you look into these clusters, what you can see is that they're actually corresponding to different types of categories. So that you see like the body parts are clustering together: food, plants, animals, instruments, etc. So in other words, what we are capturing with this similarity structure here really seems to be also like including categorization or the category. And we quantify this by just running some sort of classification approach to see how well can we actually predict the category that an individual thing is belonging to based on these 49 dimensions. And we end up getting an accuracy of around like 86 to 87%, which is really like matching the performance of state-of-the-art embeddings like from machine learning. But by only using these 49 dimensions that we derive from the similarity judgments. So I think that's actually quite nice, because what this tells us that we can actually get category for free by just looking at these similarity judgments. Okay, but like the actual question is, are these dimensions interpretable? Can we actually do something useful with these dimensions? So what I want to show you next is like for a given dimension, I'm going to show you the images that have the highest weight in that dimension. So these are like the images most representative, if you want, of that dimension. And we also asked like 20 participants to name the dimensions, to provide names for them. So we have word clouds for how often they named like different words. And then I'm going to plot like the weights of those dimensions in this plot here. Okay, you ready? Great. So let's start with one dimension here, and this dimension is a dimension that clearly seems to be related to animals, right? Where you can see like, okay, this could be really like just capturing animals as such, but what you may also appreciate is that it's actually not only tied to that specific cluster here, it's actually you also find some degree of animal relatedness also going into like other parts of this representational space here. This dimension here seems to be more like related to tools or tool-like objects, but then you get really interesting other things as well. So you also get like something that's related more to colors or the colorfulness of different stimuli. You get something related to shape, like the roundness of different objects, or something that's a bit more fine-grained, like related to patterns or piles. So in other words, what this approach has actually done now is revealed a set of interpretable dimensions that are like both more like high-level conceptual, but also more like basic visual, spanning like the different types of features that people use when they make these types of similarity judgments. And what you can now do is you can actually turn the whole thing around, and you can look at individual images, and you can start to characterize these images as a combination of these different dimensions. So you may think that like this image of a peacock here is related to like an animal, it's like plant related or green, it's colorful, has like a repetitive pattern here, or is something special. Or the squid here is something that's like food related, but also animal related, is related to water or blue, or it might be something slimy or disgusting. This is what we got from the ratings. Okay, so so this is nice. There's one limitation, of course. So it's really cool that we can like identify these types of dimensions here. But if you now want to go ahead and you want to say, okay, what are the dimensions going to be like for this other image here? I have to say, I'm sorry, I don't know. We actually have to like acquire another massive data set here because that's what we're going to need in order to figure out like what are the dimensions of a novel image really. So we wanted to overcome this challenge, and the approach that we chose is, let's see if we can actually predict the similarity with a deep neural network. So this is work from 𝗠𝗿𝗁 𝗏𝗂, who's a grad student in our lab, and what he did is he just took these images, put them through a deep neural network. In this particular example, we used CLIP model, and then predicting like each one of those individual dimensions from these deep neural network activations. And then finally, from the dimensions, we could then go ahead and then make model predictions about the predicted similarity. Okay, so let me just look at the time. Okay, sorry, how much time do I have actually, until when? Plenty, good, I just wanted to know. Okay, okay, so can we predict the similarity of any kind of object-image pairs actually using this deep neural network? What people have been doing in the past really is like to just take the activations of a neural network, and if you correlate them and to predict the similarity, you get like a good correlation, I think, but it's really, really far away from the noise ceiling. If you take more advanced approaches like feature reweighting, you get much, much closer. But if you really like do predictions with these types of dimensions, you can now actually again get at the noise ceiling. So you can really predict the similarity of different images quite well with this like 49-dimensional embedding using this deep neural network, at least for these like diverse images that we used. But another thing that's actually quite nice is now that we have this like image computable model of these individual dimensions, we can now go about and take an individual image that we just showing the neural network, and we can now make predictions about what parts of the images are actually being used by people when they are making these judgments. Right? So we can see what parts of the images may be responsible for the similarity judgments. So or you can look at, for example, this body part related dimension, and you can see that it's obviously highlighting the body parts of the person. Like a text related dimension would be like highlighting this part here, or like a colorful dimension, the sleeve of that person. Or for this dimension here, the fire or heat-related dimension would be like where the fire pit is. Water and blue would be covering the water. And what you can then also do is you can just put all of them together, and then you get like an integrated image of what are actually the parts of an image that are like relevant for making similarity judgments. So just to summarize this part, and I also just want to also mention George is here because he's been doing very, very similar things specifically for tools, and I think it's actually really nice to see this convergence of research here, that we revealed like some dimensions that are underlying a mental representation of objects, and that these representations can actually be captured with a fairly small number of interpretable dimensions. And that these dimensions are also like useful for categorization and prediction, but beyond category, they're also like capturing many of the visual features and other types of semantic features that would not be just being described as these like simple like ways of labeling a world around us. Okay, so this brings me to the second part of the talk, to now coming like to core dimensions in the brain and what is the function of the ventral visual system. So when you look at the relationship of like these human similarity judgments, what people have been doing in the past is they've been doing representational similarity analysis, take like perceived similarity judgments and then relate them to patterns of brain activity. And when you do that, what you typically find is that more like high-level visual cortex is really like correlating strongly with these similarity judgments. And we also find the same when we run like the searchlight approach, where here's like posterior cortex and here's anterior, and you can really appreciate that like it's more like high-level visual cortex that seems to be correlating most strongly with the similarity judgments. So what this indicates is that, that this information that is more like tied to the behavioral relevance of objects is really like found at these higher level visual regions, and that early vision is maybe not playing so much of a role. However, this approach of using the similarity judgments is, of course, integrating across all of the possible dimensions that are used for making these judgments. And now what you can ask yourself is, well, what actually happens when you look at the mapping of the behaviorally relevant dimensions that we've identified to the patterns of brain activity? So what we did is we ran a voxel encoding model using these behavioral relevant dimensions for all of the images that we've been looking at. And here's what we find. These are the regions that are showing like information that is related to these 49 different dimensions. Or in this particular case, we actually use a higher dimensional model. And what you see is that it's actually now much more highly distributed. So we're finding information related to these behavioral relevant dimensions even at the earliest cortical processing stages. Right? So what this really like suggesting is that there's like actually widely distributed information that's not actually limited to high-level visual cortex, but it's even like found at earlier processing stages related to these behavioral relevant information. What is the topography of these dimensions? What you can do is you can look at the individual dimensions. You can see like what their beta weights are, and you can take like the example of this head-related dimension. What you find is, as probably expected, it's more closely related to phase-selective regions like FFA and OFA. You might have like an outdoors-related dimension, which is now like really activating more like the scene-related regions. And we have a body part related dimension that is now like really like activating the body part selective cortex like EBA and FBA. So what this tells us is it's really like reflecting the known response properties. But of course, there's other dimensions that haven't been mapped so much before. Food is actually one that has only recently become interesting. And this is just like one of the many dimensions we find here. But you also find like other kinds of dimensions, like something being thin or flat, or coarsely patterned, that show reproducible patterns across the different participants, right? And so what this tells you is that there's actually a lot of information to be gained by moving away from the way of characterizing the visual system just purely based on these high-level categories, but really moving into these types of like dimensions. So we're replicating the known topography and integrating this knowledge, but also uncovering new types of topographies using these types of representational dimensions. Again, what we can do is we can turn the whole process around and now look at what is actually the tuning of each brain region for these different object dimensions. So first what we can do is we can identify like a tuning profile across all of our different dimensions here. So you can see that like in area V1, that would be the tuning profile that we find, and a lot of these are really related to more basic visual features as expected, but you also find something actually quite much related to food, which I'm happy to discuss later. It's really interesting, I think. And you find like these other kind of profiles. Now what you can do is you can try to find images whose like dimension profile best matches the dimension profile that we find here for the individual region. So what are the kind of the ideal images that you want to be showing to these regions according to their behavioral relevance? Okay, so for that we use this dimension prediction approach. We just do it on all like different types of things images, and here's what we find. So what we find in early vision is actually you find images that are very, very fine-grained. For HV4, you find images that are a bit more colorful, but like a bit more coarse-grained. And if you go to these category selective regions, you find body parts in EBA, you find faces in FFA. In OFA, we actually find more like animal faces, and in PPA, you find something that's more like related to scenes, even though we actually didn't really intentionally include scenes here, but it's just something that fell out of this. So this tuning for these behaviorally relevant dimensions really seems to be capturing the known selectivities of these different regions. And I think it's really something we should like think about a little bit more, because everything that we did is we put in these dimensions here. We didn't like put in specific types of feature models or anything. This is like literally only based on these like behaviorally relevant dimensions, and still we can actually recover the known selectivities in these individual regions. So what is actually the explanatory power of the dimensions relative to high-level category? And to address this question, what we did is we carried out variance partitioning to look at the category selective responses, the dimension selective responses, and their overlap. So what is actually explained by both of them together. And here is the response of what you find in the visual system for what has actually been like driving responses both for the categories and for the dimensions, also like in the dorsal stream. But here what you see is the unique contribution of categories and then the unique contribution of the dimensions. And I think you can appreciate that the dimensions are adding a lot of additional explanatory value beyond just the categories themselves. So the category really seems to be only capturing part of the behaviorally relevant responses to objects here. Okay, so you may ask, well, okay, wait a second. So is it actually possible that within this dimensional framework that category selectivity is just maybe a special case along this spectrum of dimensions. Is it possible that for like category selective regions, of course, you have like a response only to very, very few dimensions, because that's like a face selective region should only be responding to faces specifically, or mostly to faces, but not like to a lot of other things, whereas other regions maybe have a much more mixed selectivity. So to test that, what we did is we just looked at the sparsity of the response profile across like the different dimensions. In other words, if you have a region that is responding only to very few dimensions, it would have a sparse, like a high sparseness. Whereas if it's a region that is responding to all sorts of dimensions, it would have a dense representation. And here's what you find. So you see that the regions that have like the most sparse response profile are really nicely corresponding also to the category selective regions that have been identified in the past in the visual system. We were also interested, as a side remark, to also see if we can discover new types of selectivities. And you may see like there's something here interesting in the frontal cortex. This is actually a dessert-related response. And then I spoke with Jason Avery about this, and he's like, oh, we've known this for so long already that there's like food selective responses in here. Okay, I mean, I didn't know about it, but I thought it was quite interesting. So category selective regions do have like a sparse response profile here. Indeed, as predicted, and this really is reflecting the extreme case of the dimensions. So in other words, maybe one of the reasons why we have identified these category selective responses is, well, it's actually been quite easy to find them, because we just have to show like specific types of stimuli, and then these regions are like the ones that we show. But once you go to mixed selectivities, it just becomes much more difficult. Okay, how much time is left now? I don't really know. When did I start? Do you have like 5 more minutes? Okay. Oh, never mind. Okay. So I'll just keep going until you stop me. Okay. Okay, great. Following up on this work that I was just showing to you using this data set where we now map like the dimensions of that we've identified based on like behavior, we wanted to actually also see, can we actually go into the brain and directly identify dimensions from the patterns of brain activity? Do they actually correspond to something like this at all? And to do this, we moved away from the things data that we've been using so far, because they're not optimized for these purely data-driven approaches. And we've actually started to work with a natural scenes data set, even though I think it's not optimal, but it's currently like the only publicly available data set that gives you the possibility to do these types of data-driven analyses. And Lenny van Dijk, who's a grad student in 𝗠𝗿𝗁𝗁𝗍 in my lab, has been working on this. If you're interested, he has the poster presentation today, poster number 15. So what he looked at is responses in the patterns of brain activity, and he's then directly identifying some underlying dimensions using this so-called Bayesian non-negative matrix factorization, an approach that was spearheaded here by 𝗠𝗿𝗁𝗍𝗁𝗍 in Nancy Cambridge's lab. And what Lenny is interested in is really trying to understand, okay, so if you look at the responses within these category selective brain regions, do you actually only find like one dimension that is like the one dimension that you think that the region should be responding to, or are there actually also other types of selectivities that you find in there? And for the example of FFA, here's like one dimension. It's the first dimension that you find, and you can see that this is definitely like a face or like a people-related dimension based on these data. Oops. And sorry, for some reason it's not showing the results. Okay, so I'm just gonna. The animations weren't working. So, here are some of the other dimensions that he found. So this dimension here is related maybe to like more like people or body parts or bodies. This one here is related to text. This one here more strongly like related to people in motion or things in motion in general. And this dimension here is related to food. So these are like different types of dimensions that just were found quite consistently that just came out of like this breaking down these types of analyses. And you may think that, okay, but wait a second, I mean, like, I kind of expect to find some like body part related responses, or like maybe even like some text related responses in FFA, because like they're really like overlapping with FBA, and then there's also like VWFA like very close to it, and then of course now we have these food selective responses, and they're kind of overlapping. But then you might think, okay, well, but we were talking about category selective regions here, right? So they should actually be responding to one thing only. So what Lenny did is he actually looked at the spatial distribution of these like different types of dimensions, and it actually gets quite interesting. So if you look at the overlap here of fusiform body area and the fusiform face area, and you're looking at these types of dimensions here that are like predicting from the FFA, and you take this dimension here that's more like related to people, the body parts, what you can see is that this is actually specifically related to the overlap between FFA and FBA, right? So what this indicates is, rather than these just being like discrete responses where one region is only responding to bodies and one region is actually only responding to faces, in actual fact, perhaps a bit more of an explanatory value can come from the idea that there are actually these underlying dimensions that are related to faces, are related to bodies, but you can also find these mixed selectivities in between. And if you now go to FBA and you do the same there, and you're finding like the face component in here, you can actually see the same, that again, like the face part is actually more closely associated with the overlap between these two regions. Okay? So this is painting a more general picture of not actually just thinking about like category, but actually thinking about like the underlying selectivities and different like types of maps that are not like discrete and not separated from each other, but that actually overlap with each other, which is in line with what we typically find. Okay, thanks. So this data-driven, like dimension-based analysis really reveals some mixed selectivity within these category selective clusters. Okay, so this was giving us like a bit of a coarse-grained idea of what is actually going on within these category selective regions. What Oliver from our lab was interested in doing is seeing, can we actually get at more like a fine-grained dimensional selectivity within these category selective regions? Is there actually more than these high-level like categorical responses, or let's say more like category-related responses than have been described before? And to address this question, what he did is like he just borrowed the same approach that we've been using for understanding dimensions in behavior, which is like our typical approach. We collect odd one out behavior and then infer dimensions from human choices. And what he did is he just said, okay, why don't we just take like the brain as a participant? We get our functional MRI data from a given region. We extract the activation patterns from that region. And now we just pretend that the brain is now doing the odd one out task. So we can compute like a very, very large number of possible triplets here where we are looking at the similarities. And now what we're finding is that like we can now define like an embedding, like inferring these dimensions from like the brain's choices, if you want. And if we do this, and the approach that we chose for doing this is that we fit a DNN brain model, which is currently like the best model of predicting category selective responses in the fusiform face region. This is from Ratan Murthy's and Nancy Camrish's lab. We get the predicted activity for all of our things images. We sample 40 million triplets from these FFA, synthetic FFA responses, and then we fit our sparse positive similarity approach on these triplet choices. And with 40 million trials, it takes a lot longer, but this actually works. And you may ask, well, are these dimensions that we find here interpretable? This is ongoing research, by the way, so I'm among the first people we're showing this to. And what we find is, as expected, like some face-related responses. What we also find here, which I find quite interesting, is an animal face-related component that's specific, like not to humans, but like actually to animal faces. We find things that are more like foveal, like central, which is also something you may expect because there's a foveal bias in the FFA. We find round objects. We find objects with a lot of texture, a lot of pattern. This is just like you're just seeing trees, but if you move down further, you see it's actually more like a texture-related thing. And you see some interesting thing that's related to like hands or like body parts. So this is like the first glance here, and we're now like actually putting these stimuli and these types of dimensions back into the scanner, and we're looking specifically, do they actually also respond like selective, do they actually evoke selective responses in regions like the FFA? Do we find like this kind of distributed maps that maybe have like these specific responses that are then overlapping with responses in the fusiform face area? So to summarize, I hope I convinced you that these representational dimensions really have more explanatory power for understanding representations in ventral visual cortex than category. And it's really interesting, I think, that all of ventral visual cortex is really carrying information that is relevant to how we're making sense of the world, even like the earliest cortical processing stages. I think we need to figure out whether these are really used in our behavior as well, or whether these are just like let's say correlates of these responses, or are they actually also causally relevant for how we're making sense. The feature selectivity in the visual hierarchy may actually not just simply reflect pre-processing for object recognition, but in fact actually might be an integral part of the way in which we're making sense. So we should ideally not just focus on the ways in which we categorize the world, but we can also just have to probably should incorporate much more the different ways in which one specific stimulus that we're seeing right in front of us is appearing. We shouldn't necessarily try to think what are the properties of an apple, but we should embrace the idea that, well, there is an apple right in front of us, and when we're looking at it, these are the features that are most relevant for the processing of this type of stimulus here. So what I'm suggesting is really that we should be moving beyond this kind of category-centric view to a more meaning-centric, or if you want, behaviorally relevance-centered approach for understanding ventral vision. With that, I'd like to thank the lab, the Vision Computation Cognition Group, and the Computation Cognitive Neuroscience Lab. Also, great thanks to the Baker Lab, where we started most of this work, and the Machine Learning Core has been really instrumental in developing these methods. If you are interested in using any of these approaches, you can find some links here. And finally, I also want to draw your attention to two more posters from a lab with Susan looking at an alternative method for inferring mental representations using drawings, and then Marlon asking the very interesting question of what do the different similarity tasks that have been used in the past actually measure. With that, yeah, very grateful, thankful for being able to give a presentation here. I'm happy to take your questions.
That was exactly 45 minutes. I suspect there'll be lots of questions.
Oh, there's one here.
Okay. Anybody in the back there? All right, Marius, why don't you start?
Thanks a lot, yeah. Does it work? Yeah. Thanks, that's really amazing work and also very, very valuable resource for everyone. I really liked your introduction, also your conclusions, but I would usually interpret that a little bit differently. So I remember a talk by Ken Nakayama, I think it was titled The Enormity of Vision, and he also explains the many different functions that vision serves, of course, reading, social cognition, navigation, action, and it seems that the visual system needs to serve all of those functions. And here you've specifically focused on the odd one out task. Is this capturing the enormity of vision, you think? Are these dimensions behaviorally relevant, or are they sort of a more continuous way of categorizing or labeling?
No, it's a really, really good question, a really important question. And I'm hoping I didn't make that extremely strong claim that this is the only thing that's doing. But what the odd one out task is doing, I think, is providing the minimal kinds of ways in which you can categorize things in the world, right? You have a set of 3 objects, 2 things belong to one thing, one thing belongs to something else. So we are, in a sense, actually back to categories if you want, but these are not the kinds of natural categories that people have been normally talking about, right? So, and the ways in which we make sense, so this is, I think, in a way, allowing us to figure out what are actually the ways in which we structure the world around us, in which we can make sense, in which we can kind of map our percept to the different basic kind of dimensions, essentially, that we use, and the most important parts that we use for making sense. And I think the key point I wanted to make here is really that the focus has been so strong on these high-level categories and these labels and the kinds of objects that we've been neglecting all of this kind of other ways in which we are making sense, and that our focus has been really like just trying to figure out what is actually generalizing for, like, let's say the example of an apple, without actually embracing the fact that we have an apple right in front of us, and that is carrying information, and you don't only want to generalize to different apples, but you may actually want to generalize to different things that are green or different things that are round, right? So so then you may say, okay, but is that everything? And I completely agree. No, of course it's not. There's many different ways in which you can interact with the world. I think, though, that like this is getting us closer to like a more complete like understanding of what the visual system is doing. I think this is like a step in the direction that I would like to go. But I totally agree that like it's not capturing the types of behaviors or even like affordances that are like related to the world. And this is like really, really interesting. So this is like the kind of next level, if you want, like incorporating tasks as well as like actually a meaningful and very important kind of like direction. But it's much harder than just looking at stimuli.
Well, thank you for that amazing talk. You okay? Yeah. I was struck by a slide that you had in the middle of the talk where you showed that categories predicted very little variance, and then the dimensions actually explained the lion's share of the variance. And I appreciate that you get to 49 dimensions in a manner that's agnostic as to the high-level category of the stimuli. You kind of let the data drive the dimensions. And then, of course, the question becomes, well, is that just the best way to partition the variance you see in behavior, or are those dimensions actually, you know, psychologically or neurally real and have validity in terms of brain organization? And then you showed a number of demonstrations of showing essentially that dimensions seem to map in meaningful ways onto the known organization of the ventral stream. But I was struck by the fact that the best examples of where dimensions do seem to map onto the ventral stream are essentially just recapitulations of categories. You know, this dimension is the face dimension. Well, is that the face dimension, or is it just the face category that's falling out of your data? And so, like, could you kind of flip this around and say, well, even when you take this agnostic approach, it turns out that categories kind of fall out of the data. And so the comparison between the green and the red isn't really the relevant comparison, because the categories are already represented in the red among some of those dimensions. So the comparison is between within the dimensionality space, the dimensions that are easily interpretable or labelable in terms of categories, versus the other dimensions that don't seem to have any kind of particular. Yeah. And if you do that, do you actually find that the dimensions that don't have a category gloss, what kind of variance do they explain?
Yeah, it's actually interesting because we didn't include, we only included the dimensions here that are most closely associated with the categories. But it actually would have been interesting to also look at the comparison here, how much the remaining dimensions are actually explaining. And honestly, I don't know. It would be interesting, but it's like there's still a lot of dimensions left, so I'm kind of hoping that there is a lot more to be explained here. But it's definitely something we should look into. The key message I wanted to deliver here really is that if you think about like the functional organization as really like primarily being driven by category, we have an alternative explanation here, which is based on these dimensions, and it has great explanatory value. So if something is explaining more than another like alternative model, then you may want to consider that the alternative is perhaps like a better model of that. So that's kind of what we wanted to say here. And of course it makes sense, right? Like, I mean, if you think about it in some ways, some people might say this is obvious because category is a binary thing. Like all animals are lumped together. And we're treating with an animal category, of course, we have a mammal category as well, but like with an animal category, you're treating like a mosquito to be like the same thing as like a lion. Of course it's not, right? Like, of course we know that like there's some typicality, right? Like we know that there's like some objects are more like going to have like stronger effects than others, right? So in some way you may say like, okay, that's expected, but like still for some reason like people are like thinking about it in this very like dominant way that like it is all category. And what we just wanted to emphasize here, well, I mean, it's a bit more complicated than that. and we're dealing with something that's more like a continuous thing, right? So it's just not, same with goes for face responses. I don't think it's just like faces and versus no faces, but there's some sort of gradation in there. And that's something I think we should also be taking into account because it's teaching us a lot about the organization here.
Okay. I think it's very interesting. I mean, let me just say, I think there is an interesting assumption that in the measure to which category is the best description of the dimensions that explain the variance, that it needs to be sharp. And it's not clear to me that you couldn't have category as sort of a reasonable label of what a dimension is, and yet admit that there's also continuity at the edges of that. So I'm not sure those need to go together.
Yeah, I mean, I'm also not saying that categories are not important. I think category is like a very strong and like one of the dominant kind of, I guess, responses that you do find for high-level vision. I think it's not like a coincidence that we have been studying things according to category for so long. But yeah, as I said, like I think it would be really good if we also like think about like not the non-categorical, also non-taxonomic kinds of like features that are also like driving these responses, also in high-level vision, including like, let's say, curvature, for example, which I think is just like really important dimensions to consider.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. This was a great talk, and I have a lot of sympathy for this idea of thinking from the point of view of dimensions. But I'm wondering what like the other side to this is, and it's a little bit related also to the question that was just asked. So I guess at least in let's say the visual community, everybody that thinks about categories, they use the word category. I mean, let's say for example face, but they all know it has to be computed from a stimulus, and so there's already for a long time this idea, for example, and you have foveal receptive fields, so you have features like contours. So the curvature and so on, that is also coded in those regions. But the idea is that often that it's coded to serve the category function of the region, right? So let's say category would be put first, and then all these other selectivities are there because of processing the category. But already in that idea, it's much more complicated than just a binary label. And I was very happy to see that you went into this idea of taking these DNN models of 𝗠𝗿𝗁𝗏 and 𝗠𝗿, because you could take that as the more nuanced view of looking at category. And I'm wondering to what degree everything you're showing here, you could map it back to the more traditional way of thinking and explain the same amount of data. So this suggests you explain much less with category, but it's the binary version. But if you take the version of 𝗠𝗿𝗁𝗏 and 𝗠𝗿𝗁𝗏, that kind of way of thinking about category, and you would take that as to compare with other things, and you would go for other classic things that people have, like color. I noticed like you have the dimension like water/blue. Yeah. Well, then I think, well, that's kind of arbitrary. Maybe we should just call it blue. And so what if you add color to it, and then you have something like spatial frequency? So you have added a dimension with clutter. Then I think as a vision scientist, oh, spatial frequency. Yeah. Right. So if I take all these classic dimensions and then a rich definition of category, and I put all of that in the mix, maybe I explain the same thing as you explain with your dimensions. It's more like a reorientation of that. You do some, I forgot the word of the Procrustes rotation that they have in factor analysis, right? You have the same space, but you sort of rotate it back into the space that we already knew before. Could we do that?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. And it's also coming like back to the question of, I mean, isn't this just like, giving us already what we kind of assume to be there? And you could say, well, okay, first of all, obviously, it's giving you a weighted version of that. So at least we would know which dimensions matter more than others, which I think in itself is already relevant, because there's a whole large set of features that can potentially be explaining this, and we don't necessarily know which ones are the ones that matter more than others. So I think that's at least something that is valuable in that respect as well. But then, of course, you can go go even further, and you could say, okay, so maybe these types of dimensions that you find here, as you say, just reflecting these kinds of known selectivities that we already have in terms of the stimulus coding. And that's, I think, where it gets really interesting to, I mean, all we're doing here is we're asking people to give us ratings about similarities, and we, despite like this very simplicity, we find these types of dimensions, right? So what this at least tells us is that, okay, so these are like types of dimensions that are relevant, but what this doesn't tell us, and I think that's one thing I want to be doing in the future, is what is the causal relevance of these dimensions for behavior. And in this simple case, it would be actually some sort of categorization behavior, but not like high-level categories, but the kind of behavior like, let's take the food response that we get, and that's, I think, a really nice example. We find food responses in early visual cortex. The reason why we find food responses in early visual cortex is that a lot of the food stimuli are actually very cluttered. So they have a lot of this like spatial, like higher spatial frequencies. You may say that's a confound because you just chose stimuli that ended up being cluttered. And I'm saying, no, it's actually not a confound, it's a feature, because I think that the fact that something has a cluttered experience, has a cluttered appearance is going to be informative about the presence of food. So that's actually an interesting thing to test. That's something I want to actually specifically be testing. To what degree does actually, like, let's say, clutteredness actually predict the presence of food? Because then we can make actually an even stronger claim, not a claim that I was hoping to make today, but we could potentially even make the claim to say that these dimensions are not only like a potentially like more, like say broader, give you a broader view onto like the organization of the visual system, but they could actually mean like, no, actually all of the visual system is actually used in behavioral readout. And that would be really interesting, but that's something we still have to investigate in the future. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Martin. That was very inspiring. Is the preference for different dimension distributed in the cortex in a sort of predictable way? Is there like a lower dimensional embedding maybe that you can find that explains why some bit of the cortex has a preference for one dimension and not for the other?
No, it's a really good question. This is something we can't really say much about. What we find is that let me actually see if I find this. What we did recently is we tried to see how reproducible the dimensional patterns are across the visual system for the different subjects that we have. So we looked into like seeing, okay, are these actually like similarly distributed maps, or is it that this is like something very heterogeneous, right? And what we find is that for some dimensions, it's extremely reliable. For other dimensions, it's more in the middle, and there are some dimensions that don't reproduce at all. One example dimension that doesn't reproduce at all in the ventral visual system is like the stereotypically feminine dimension, which is like a dimension that is just like with lipstick, high heels, flowers. It's just something that came out. It kind of makes sense that this dimension may not reproduce that well, right? But at least like in terms of the spatial organization, I was surprised to see like the degree of reproducibility. I thought it was actually quite nice. But what we can't really say much about, I think, is like why the spread is like the way it is. I think that's a really interesting question, and that's something that people have been starting to address with category selective responses, and I think it would be extremely valuable to look at something similar. So people have also done this with some dimensions, right, like a curvature or even like with animacy. Exactly. But I think it would be really interesting to like address these kind of like why the organization is that way, even like for this like broad spectrum of different dimensions that we've been describing here. Because now we're not talking about selectivities where it's one region doing only one thing, but we talk about like overlapping maps here.
Thank you for your talk, Martin. I'm curious about the relationship between the dimensions that you're getting out of your embedding model. So in two different ways. So first of all, the dimensions have different importance as you get them. So I'm wondering what's your current thinking about whether or not there is an underlying hierarchy, or can you say more about the relationship between these dimensions, A, in a hierarchical manner, and B, in terms of their temporal unfolding? Have you done, or what's your reasoning, or what's your, I don't know how to do this, but I'd be curious to know, because the dimensions you get, some of them are more high-level semantic, and some of them are more concrete, right?
Yeah, okay, so this is very hard, a very hard question. So the First of all, about the importance of the individual dimensions, right? I mean, of course, the way in which we sample the different stimuli, we try to be as broad, semantically broad as possible. One thing that one also has to take into account here, though, is that with that breadth, we're not necessarily getting representativeness in the sense of like, because we are experiencing around us like a lot of faces, a lot of like scenes, a lot of certain things, right? So that what this could lead to a certain degree is some overweighting of certain dimensions as compared to others, right? But I think that in the natural sense, the dimensions that you get, like the ones that are like dominant, if you want, are going to be the ones that are also like related to like how much you experience these objects, how much they actually matter for you for like making sense of the world, right? What happens if we take away like certain examples of a category? So let's say we reduce the number of food stimuli, would we still find the food dimension? So something that we tried, and the dimensions actually end up being very stable, which is good. So it's not like just dependent on the stimulus that we use, but what we find is then that the relative importance of that dimension goes down, which also makes sense, of course. If you have fewer of those stimuli in your set, it goes down. So what we don't know, and we can't necessarily answer, is what's the relative importance of those dimensions, like in absolute terms. That's something that I'm also very curious of, is like, can we in some way quantify the like representational importance of different objects in our like mental representation? Something like typicality, but at the more general level of objects, like one level higher. How important are actually different objects for our mental representation? Something I think is really interesting. Coming to your question about the hierarchy, we haven't looked into like the hierarchical organization. It's something that's quite interesting. I know that other people who've been using this dimensional approaches have done like hierarchical clustering and found some interesting structures there. It's not something that we've looked at. And in terms of like temporal evolution of those signals, that's something that 𝗠𝗿𝗁 has actually started to look at, and we have a preprint on bioRxiv on this. So if you're interested, you can check it out, and it's actually quite interesting to see the structures there. Yeah, so but in terms of like the conceptual versus perceptual part, that's also like a little bit more challenging, because even like if you think of the redness dimension, it's kind of hard to know if this is like really a purely like visual dimension, or if it's actually reflecting the knowledge of something being read, and that's a little harder to tease apart. Yeah, something we're also working on at the moment.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to go back to how you the hand picking of the images.
What, sorry?
How you hand pick the, manually pick the images, and the consequences that might have for the overlap between dimensions and categories. Because I'm guessing, but perhaps you're going to tell me I'm wrong, that you tried to pick good examples of the exemplars of the objects. So you tried to pick good examples of apples and good examples of whatever else, cars. But of course, what's amazing about our conceptual system is that we can categorize really bad examples of things too. And even like in your opening, the opening examples you gave of like the rotten apple or the moldy bread and things like that. Really bad examples of apples and bread we can categorize. So I guess I'm just curious about, I just want to hear more about how you pick the examples and where what happens to really, really bad exemplars of a category.
Yeah, that's great. So it depends on how you define bad, right? Because, I mean, first of all, for some categories, it was extremely hard to find examples at all. One, like of natural images. One example is dynamite. You don't find natural images, like color images of dynamite, because they just don't exist, like in a museum maybe. Or a wooden leg. These are like crazy categories, but they were in there because people were able to name these objects. What we wanted to have is that we wanted the images to be clearly recognizable, right? So having examples where people cannot clearly tell what that object on the image is, that's something we try to avoid. We looked at the visual diversity of the images within like different categories. With like a deep neural network. So we wanted to see to what degree can we actually tell based on visual features alone what the category is going to be, and the performance of that prediction was very poor. So at least what we can say is that the visual diversity of the stimuli is good. At the same time, I agree. I think it would be really interesting to have poorer examples that I think we may have like a bit of a focus of the camera, like the image is always going to be more in the center, right? Or the object is going to be more in the center than on the in the side or something like that. And I think it would be really interesting to look at like broader kinds of sets of images. One thing that we are working on right now, this is an fMRI data set, is that we use a bit more of a data-driven approach for stimulus selection there. So we have like a set of 2 billion images, and we have for these images, we have neural network activations. They've actually been put online, so we can just look at them. And we're now sampling maximally diverse from that set of activations and just looking at like different images to kind of cover the breadth of the stimulus space that is at least provided by these images. But even there, you still have the problem, like there's a photographer bias in there, right? Like whoever's taking the picture is going to have like an intention of what they want to be showing. So that's, it's a challenge.
Thanks.
Well, let me jump in here. So if one of the main take-home messages is we should think of the ventral stream with regards to dimensions, maybe a lumpy space of dimensions as opposed to categories. But what is the organizing principle for dimensions?
You mean like how do the dimensions emerge?
Yeah. I mean,
yeah.
There's got to be organization. We know there's a spatial representation across the ventral stream.
No, yeah,
So now now we're talking about dimensions, but so how are they organized?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I don't know. Like, how do they come about?
How about category?
Yeah, exactly. Well, there we have the dimensions, right? But no, but it's the same problem, right? It's exactly the same thing. But we're just shifting the goal, right? Like before, it's been like, okay, how are the categories coming about? And at least you could say, okay, how are the dimensions?
That's a longer discussion for sure.
Yeah.
But one other issue that came to mind is this. As you know, this area is always part of a network, very different networks, right? So we know about face patches. We saw the action network that went to certain parts of the ventral stream, which led to these connectivity hypotheses. And now it's really hard to think about connectivity from the ventral stream to the rest of these category-related areas if it's just the dimensions that we don't have any organization for.
Yeah, I'm very sorry, the brain is just a very complicated organ, right? But don't blame me on that.
I'm puzzled.
Yeah.
I was hoping you'd have an answer to these issues.
I mean, but it's one thing that's nice though is that we can predict those dimensions with a deep neural network. So at least, I mean, that's in a sense it's nice because it means that we have at least a tool available that can maybe tell us a little bit about like, okay, so we can make this image computable, and when we can make this image computable, then we have at least a pathway towards modeling this and then coming up with ideas of how this organization is coming about.
So how are you thinking about visual word form?
Oh boy. Now, give me a bit more of a cue because that's like.
Yeah, I mean, that can be incorporated in models that are not based on these kinds of dimensions.
Yeah.
And we know it's there. We know it has connectivity into the language system as opposed to other areas, and it's a puzzle, right?
It is. It's very hard, but like. I mean, it's something that I think is sticking out a little bit because it's not something that you can explain with evolution, right? Because it's so recent that, but yeah, again, like it's very hard to know exactly. I don't have any like strong opinions on this, so then I better remain silent on that.
Anybody? That can't be the last question. Brad, oh.
Yeah, I have a lot smaller question than Alex's question. I was about your positivity constraint. I was pondering on that because I think oftentimes concepts can also be defined actually by sort of strong negative loading on certain things, right? Like a bag would not load on the food dimension, but then poison would really load on the food dimension in a negative way, right? It's really something you don't eat. Or like if you have a cuteness dimension, a zombie is like a good example of a very non-cute entity, etc. Right? So I was just curious why you think objects are either in every dimension is either 0 or positive. Does that not kind of like leave half of the equation out?
Yeah, no, it's good. It's good I'm bringing this up. So this is something I've been wondering about in the beginning myself a lot. Like, wait, but we have also like other ways of describing things from going from one end of the spectrum to another. And if you actually look at the results that people show when they're doing like principal component analysis or something on patterns of brain activity, it gets really interesting because typically what you find is like there's people on one end and then food on the other end of the spectrum. But you know that like people are not like the opposite of food. At least not to my knowledge, right? So what this is doing, this approach here, is giving you a so-called parts-based description. So you are saying that you're really decomposing something into its individual components. And that's what we are typically doing when we're analyzing, at least that's what we think we're doing when we're analyzing the world. So if you think about like something that you can characterize according to a positive to negative dimension, within this parts-based description, this would actually be split up into, right? So that like something that is, in our case, for example, something that is disgusting, that would be one dimension, but something that is like, I don't know, something that's positive or that valuable, has a lot of value, would then be another dimension, right? So you could, in principle, also like put these dimensions then back together. But the big thing with like not wanting to include negativity is really that like if you have the poisonous dimension, you don't want that to necessarily act against the fact that something is food, because it's like defining whether like something is food, if that makes sense.
Yeah, partly, but I think to some degree it sounds like you will have then independent dimensions that are fully anti-correlated, right? If you would have good and bad, for example, right? That's
yeah.
They are basically defining each other. If something is good, it's not bad, and if it's bad, it's not good.
Yeah, yeah, so. Exactly. In the extreme case, it would be that way. We don't find that. We have dimensions that are very strongly anti-correlated. Like, for example, we have a man-madeness / hardness dimension, and that has a strong negative correlation with this animal-related dimension and with a with a food-related dimension, but like then the correlation is not perfect, and it actually is really funny because like if you look at a broader organization, then what you find is that it's like not man-made natural, but it's actually man-made animal, natural, food. So all of these are kind of on the other side, and food is something different because it's neither natural nor man-made, or it's both in a sense, right? But so if you take that kind of dimensional view, that you say like, okay, now I'm actually wanting to describe the organization according to something that's going from negative to positive, you can do that, right? It's just like a different level of description, right? So that would be like, if you take it just like a one-dimensional framework, then that's what you would find. It's going from man-made all the way to natural, or from inanimate to animate. But now with these dimensions, you can actually get at something that's a bit more fine-grained. Cool.
Brad, can you do this in 30 seconds? And can we get a 30-second answer?
Yeah. So I just wanted to pick up on your response to Alex.
Okay.
Where, you kind of, the view that you're framing is unapologetically tied to the fact that these dimensions are image computable. Mm-hmm. And so what do you make of the congenitally blind results where you find, at least some effects for faces, tools, written words, places? Where does that come from?
Yeah, that's super interesting. So we are now looking into trying to understand more of what is actually related to the semantics specifically, and what is really tied to the image. And there's different approaches that we're taking in our lab to this. So one is a collaboration with Rovereto '𝗿𝗏𝗏, where we showed congenitally blind people different words, and we compare that to representation in sighted people to just see how is their representation of these things going to be different? Is it going to be evoking more of a visual representation in sighted people as compared to blind individuals? And another approach is that we actually now have just recently collected another data set of the same objects, but not these with images, but with words as well. So we're now looking at the representational dimensions that don't have any of these image features, at least not in the stimulus itself. So we can then start to look at how these dimensions are similar between the presentation of images and the presentation of words, and what are actually the differences.
It's very important that everybody gets back here by 2 o'clock for the award presentations. Martin, thank you very much.
Thank you.